Welcome, one and all, to the very first edition of the Future is So Right podcast. I'm your host, Pete Beal, and this podcast is a Green Flame Press production. So, welcome everybody. It's great to have you here, and thank you so much for tuning in to this, our very first episode, which I hope will be the first of many. Since this is our inaugural episode, it's going to be a rather simple affair. We do not have a guest today. Hopefully, in the near future, we will have guest authors. I believe this will help us have a more fluid discussion. But for the time being, I will sit here and talk at you, and you can listen for as long as you wish. Hopefully, you'll find the program to be at least somewhat entertaining. So I was trying to decide on a topic for this episode, the first episode. And to be honest, I was struggling with it. But the answer came to me, as I think these types of things usually do, when I was just going about my normal writing routine. So right now I am working on the second draft of my second trilogy of books in the Thrall saga, book one of which will be releasing later this year, so make sure to stay tuned for additional details on that. Hopefully coming soon. Now that I've sidetracked myself with a plug, let's get back to the main topic. So I'm searching for a topic for today's podcast, and it just sort of came to me. I'm working my way through the second draft of the third book, and I'm thinking to myself, this is essentially the culmination of so much hard work. When you've written a 3-book set, you really want to stick the landing. Now, this obviously goes for any book, but when you've invested so much time of your life into this project, into this 3-book set, it's really important to you to end strong. So I thought, finishing strong. I think that's a great topic, even though it's ironic to an extent to have this on my first podcast. Hopefully I won't be finishing this series of podcasts strong with this episode. But I think it's a good topic to address, and it's one that a lot of writers struggle with. The act of finishing strong, whether that be a single book, whether that be a series of books. How do we go about doing that? Because let's face it, we've all read books where we've been so enamored with the early part of the story. There's so much potential, the characters are great, it's got a great plot line, things are moving along, and then the ending just isn't there, and you walk away from it and it really skews your view. You don't remember all those great memories of the story early on. All you remember is just a terrible ending that left you feeling cheated and that you had wasted your money on this book or on this series. Nobody wants that feeling as a reader, and nobody as a writer wants their readers to have that feeling. So I'm sitting here and I'm working on book 3 of this trilogy. And I just wrapped up chapter 13, my second draft of chapter 13. And things are sort of really starting to get going in this book. It's hit a point where it's going to start moving at a bit of a breakneck speed, and it's not really going to slow down until the very end. So I'm sitting here, and coming into this book, I was worried about this second draft. And I'll tell you why I was worried about this second draft, because this book was written for NaNoWriMo in 2020, which, of course, if you're not familiar with that, essentially means that I wrote it entirely in the month of November, or at least the first 50,000 words, which constituted almost my entire first draft. I tend to be an underwriter on my first drafts and then add later. So I did manage to succeed in my NaNoWriMo goal, and I hit my 50,000 words, but I had never written a first draft quite that fast before. I've come close. I've had first drafts that I've written in probably about 6 weeks. But in the span of 30 days, I thought, wow. And I was terrified about opening these files up for the first time since I had finished this project and examining them and thinking, oh, you idiot, you rushed this. Now, oh, good job. Now you're going to have to rewrite the entire thing from scratch. There's going to be nothing salvageable. And to be fair, I have that feeling about most of my first drafts when I reopen them for the first time. So I should be used to it by now. But it was just a little bit more intense than usual because of what I said. I felt I had rushed the first draft. So I'm going through the first few chapters and I'm thinking, okay, this actually isn't that bad. There are definitely more typographical errors than I usually have because of how fast I worked at writing this. But in terms of the plot of the story, I felt that's still strong. The characters are obviously already established from the first two books, and since I was doing these second drafts one after another, I was able to see how well they flowed together in terms of character development. You know, I've had instances where I take more time in between writing books, and it can be obvious when you go through and read them one after another that maybe you've made a mistake with a certain character. Maybe they all of a sudden started speaking in a completely different way from one book to the other. These are the sort of traps that are easy to fall into. And I wasn't finding those with this project, which I was very happy about. So I got a few chapters in, and my confidence is growing as I'm working my way through. It's a bit of a pain because, as I said, the typographical errors are more intense than usual. So that's the majority of the work I'd been doing here. But when I reach this sort of midpoint of the book where I know, okay, this thing's about to take off, this is essentially going to be the culmination of everything that's happened in the first two books and the first half of this book. And I really want this to be good because I've invested so much time in it. And if anyone's reading this, they've obviously invested so much time in it. And they deserve to get a good, strong ending that's hopefully exciting, that provides closure to some of the questions that they will have, and hopefully leave them wanting to read a future book. And I realized that I had set myself up for success without even thinking that much about what I was doing in advance. So what I'm going to say, a lot of writers will not agree with. I'm just going to tell you that right out of the gate, okay? I know, for example, that Stephen King would probably throw holy water on me for saying this and tell me I'm an idiot and that you shouldn't write like this. But I would respectfully disagree with Mr. King and with anyone else who believes the opposite of what I'm about to say. The reason that this first draft is as solid, shall we say, it's definitely not perfect, but it's a solid first draft. And the reason it's so solid, despite having been written in 30 days, is because I outlined before I wrote the book. And I'm going to go a step further with this. In case any, pantsers out there aren't already mad enough at me for saying this, I outlined the trilogy before I started writing it. Sorry, that moment of silence was so that some of you could swear at me and, stop listening to the podcast and whatever you feel you need to do. I'm not going to sit here and say that my method is going to work for you. I can't guarantee that my method will work for anybody, and you can't guarantee that your method will work for anybody. I've read countless books on writing. I mentioned Stephen King earlier. I actually have his book on writing right here. It's excellent. I recommend everyone read it and take from it whatever you feel will be useful for you. But the fact is that just because every bit of his process might work for him doesn't mean it's going to work for me, and it doesn't mean it's going to work for you. And really the only way that you're going to find what works for you is by trial and error. So why did I bring up outlining? Well, the thing is, you need to have an idea of where your story is going to end up. It's the most effective way that I have found of preventing writer's block, of getting to the end and then realizing, oh shoot, I completely forgot about that character 6 chapters ago. Now I need to go back and figure out what happened to him. Of making sure that you aren't leaving plot lines open unintentionally. So I thought, well, let's talk about closing strong, finishing strong, and let's talk about how I use an outline to do that. Now, I think outlining has a bit of a bad reputation. And I think there's a few different reasons for that, but many of those trace back, at least in my eyes, and probably for people of my generation, and I'm in my early 30s, all the way back to when we first started learning how to write in elementary school. Maybe this is just me, but I have a feeling it's not. Did anyone ever have a teacher, say around 2nd or 3rd grade, that made you outline before you wrote an essay? And we're talking, say, when we were learning how to write 5-paragraph essays. We're not talking about 10-page type of monstrosities that you would write in high school or for a college course. We're talking about straight up outlining a 5-paragraph essay about Abraham Lincoln or something along those lines. Because I had these teachers that did this, and I was not a fan of it. And they were always so rigid about how the outline had to work. Well, make sure you start with a capital A, then move down one line and put a Roman numeral 1 or whatever nonsense it was. I can't even remember all of what it was. I know it wasn't fun. I know that, and I know that I hated nothing more about it, about writing essays, than sitting down and writing that stupid outline. Just let me write the stupid essay and get it over with. Don't make me sit here and write an outline and then hand it in for a grade and then get my outline back with everything that was wrong with it and then write just let me write my essay. It's ridiculous. I mean, I'm like 8 years old and I'm sitting here thinking this is the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. And that rigid structure is a turnoff to a lot of people. And it was a turnoff to me. And I would continually hate it. Like when I would get to high school or even in college, when you would have this professor that would want you to take your notes just a certain way in his class. He doesn't care about what works best for you. This guy would stand at the front of the class and give extremely detailed notes about what we were supposed to write down from his lectures. And I mean details such as, it was a history class, so say we were talking about 18th century Japan. He would finish one aspect of what he was talking about, and then he would come to a point where he would stop, and he would say, okay, Now come down 2 lines on your piece of paper and write this headline. And he expects us to take our notes, basically copying what he was saying word for word. Which, maybe that works for some people. If that works for you, great. It doesn't work for me. It just makes my mind go dead. I didn't do so good in that class. So I think when a lot of people hear outlining for a book or for any sort of creative writing, they think of that rigid type of structure and are immediately, they remember how much they hated doing that type of thing in their past, and their first thought is, I'm never going to do that again. There's nobody here to make me do that again. I'm not doing it. It's so constrictive. And I am here to tell you that an outline can be whatever you want it to be. It doesn't need to be constrictive. So I'm going to tell you what works for me when I'm outlining. And maybe it'll be helpful for you. And maybe it won't. Maybe you need to take my formula and play around with it a little bit to find what works best for you, and that's fine. So what I will typically do is I'll start with the first book of a set, and I'll figure out the general plot, the main events that are going to happen. Okay? So I jot those down, and honestly, this comes out to about a paragraph. And no, that's not my entire outline. Don't get excited right away. That's not all the work. So what I will then do is I'll open a new document, and I'll start with chapter 1. So looking at my general overlay of events of what's going to take place in this book, I decide what's going to happen in chapter 1. And I write this down. And when I say I write this down, I mean usually 2 to 5 sentences at most. That's it. I don't need 10 paragraphs to tell me what's going to happen in a 9-page chapter. I just need the high level. It starts here, it ends here. This is something of note that happens. These are the characters involved, etc. And then I move on to chapter 2. And then chapter 3. And so on and so forth. And I've gotten this down over time. It really does take practice, but I can honestly outline a book if it's a story that I've been sitting on for a while in my mind and I've allowed it to percolate, as I say. I could write an outline in 1 to 2 days, easily. And I think anyone can get to that point, but it takes practice. And what you'll find as you're going about this outline is you can go back and you can read the outline as you go. And you're going to notice potential problems with the book before the book has even begun being written, right? So you can say your book is 30 chapters long. Okay. You're scanning your outline over before you decide to go and start writing chapter 1. And you realize to yourself, well, this is supposed to be sort of an action-adventure book, and I've got a span of about 5 chapters here in the middle where nothing is really happening from an action standpoint. Oh, maybe I should move chapters around to focus on, maybe get a chapter focusing on a different character who has something more interesting going on in the middle of this. Maybe I need to evaluate if this character's storyline needs work, things like that. So ultimately, that extra 1 or 2 days of work that you're doing at the beginning of your project is potentially saving you weeks of work down the line when you've written this whole 30 chapter book, and then you're reading it back for the first time and you realize that you just read 40 pages in what's supposed to be an action-packed book where nothing happens. You see the point I'm making there? And I think this really comes into focus towards the end of the book, because we've all read books where it seems like, at least I have, I shouldn't say we all, but I have, and I'm guessing you probably have, at least one of these at some point in your life, where you get to the ending of the book and it's almost too obvious that the author had no idea how to tie up all of the various plot lines they had started. Is that fair to say? I think we've all been there. We've all been at a point where we don't know where to go next with our story. And it's understandable. You write this large, complex manuscript, thousands and thousands of words. How can you ever think that by doing this without any sort of blueprint in place that you're going to reach a satisfying ending? It's just so complicated. I think you have to have an idea of what you're working towards. And this, I would say, goes doubly so for a series. So what I do is I outline every book in my series before I start writing book one. So before I start writing book one, I know the ending of book three. And when I know the ending of book three, while I'm writing book one, I can add things that I would have to go back and add later. Say, have you ever been reading a book and you get to the end and something happens at the end and you realize there was just a tiny little hint, maybe 20 chapters earlier, at what was going to happen there at the end of the book, and you go back and you look at it and you realize, oh yeah, that author dropped a hint of what was to come. Those are so much easier, I've found, to throw in when you know what's going to happen. Your reader doesn't know. They're reading through your chapters and they might skim right over that line. Nobody might ever notice it. It's fully possible that you're going to put in some sort of foreshadowing and nobody will ever notice it. But you will know what you did, and you're going to feel a great sense of accomplishment having done that. When you can read your own book and you're reading something in chapter 4 of book 2 and you see this little hint of what's to come in chapter 20 of book 3, and you sort of snicker to yourself a little bit like, I put that in there. It's a really rewarding feeling. So I've always been a big advocate of the outline. And I'm sure there's still going to be detractors. And that's fine. You know, if being what's known as a pantser, meaning you fly by the seat of your pants, is what works for you, I think that's great. But I think everyone sort of owes it to themselves to try both methods and see what really works for them. And I think if the only outlining you've ever done is during your schooling and your education, I think you're doing yourself a bit of a disservice by not at least opening yourself up to the possibilities. And you know what? Maybe you'll try it and you'll decide it's not for you and it doesn't work best for you. And that's fine. Go back to what works for you. But we're in such a creative business here. And I don't feel like some people do that outlining inhibits that creativity. I think it, if anything, like I alluded to with the ability to add foreshadowing in, it enhances it. When you don't have the pressure of trying to determine how a book is going to end because you already know, you get to take all sorts of creative paths on your way to get there. You're not focused on the end, you're focused on the journey. And it's a really freeing feeling for me. So at the risk of coming off a little long-winded, I think that's where we're going to go ahead and wrap up the discussion on outlining for today. And I think we're going to go ahead and start to wrap up this initial episode of the Future So Right podcast. But before we do that, I just wanted to talk a little bit about how you can get in touch with the podcast if you would like to do so. If you are watching this via YouTube, I am going to have all the appropriate links down below in the description. If you are watching this from my official PeteBeal.com website, you can find all the information you need at the menu at the top of the screen by clicking on the Future's So Right podcast link. If you'd like to correspond with the show, we'd love to have your feedback. We'd love to read any comments that you have. All you need to do is fill out the form on the website. It's pretty simple. You'll just fill out your name, email, whether or not you would like to remain anonymous, and leave your comment. It can be as long or as short as you would like. I would love to read them on our next episode. Furthermore, if you'd like to be a guest of this podcast, maybe you'd like to come on and talk about an upcoming book release, maybe you'd like to talk about your writing process and things that you've learned along your journey, talk about the publishing industry, we can really talk about just about anything you want. There's an additional form on that site that says be a guest of the podcast. So you can fill that out. There's a few more questions, but it's very simple, very self-explanatory. Fill it out, hit submit, and I will get back to you as expediently as possible, and we can hopefully arrange a date where we can record a podcast and we can talk about whatever you would like to talk about. So with that, I'm going to end this first episode of the Future So Right podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. We'll be back with another episode very shortly. Once again, if you have any topics, comments, suggestions, please check out the website. If you're watching on YouTube, it will be linked in the description below. Until then, stay safe, stay healthy, and please keep writing and stay creative. Thank you very much.